Modernizing Buddhism does not mean secularizing it. Buddhism enters life, but is not diminished in its transcendent qualities by life. Only when people see the essence of Buddhism permeate every aspect of their lives can one truly speak of Buddhism's vibrant presence in the world. Imagine a spiritual tradition constantly transforming itself to face the upheavals of its era. A system of values not confined within outdated golden rules and rigid frameworks, nor one that accepts the fading of its identity just to blend into the noisy flow of life. This is the paradox, simultaneously preserving its transcendent nature while engaging with the world. If it merely withdraws into an ivory tower, how can it permeate life? How can it inspire the community? But if it becomes engrossed in pragmatism, that unique soul will gradually fade and vanish amidst countless clamors. There are historical moments when every religious system, every cultural value must question itself. How can we avoid withering into mere form? How can our intrinsic vitality avoid being covered by moss, so that the springs of wisdom and compassion continue to flow and create? True modernization is not merely updating appearances, but accepting the painful challenge of renewal, daring to cross safe boundaries to be reborn. Amidst cultural storms, every tradition must confront a fundamental question: will we survive or vanish into history? Many people fear change, fear pain, fear loss. But if we don't dare to shed our skin, what remains but an empty shell? Only the echo of the past. The intrinsic vitality of any tradition, perhaps, lies in its ability to renew itself without losing its essence. Is it possible that in a turbulent society where conservatism and innovation constantly clash, this very friction becomes the driving force for deeper values to be more clearly recognized? Could it be that crises, the strong reactions of the old guard, are precisely the necessary test for the creative will of the new generation? If we look at the flow of history, it's easy to see that all traditions reaching for the future have undergone doctrinal revolutions, daring to admit weaknesses, daring to change to grow stronger. Any vitality risks fading if it sinks into conservatism. But each time it overcomes fear to innovate, the spirit becomes more flexible, youthful, like a sapling pushing through the thick soil of habit and fear. So, if we continually innovate, can ethics, wisdom, and compassion truly live vibrantly in everyday life? Can a tradition be brave enough to both modernize itself and preserve its original spirit, so that each passing generation is not just an inheritor, but also a creator? These questions in themselves are the spark for an unending dialogue between old and new, between stillness and movement. But it is precisely through these paradoxical twists that a great intellectual foundation becomes strong enough not just to survive, but to contribute to an ever-evolving society. In those days, people often thought of spirituality as something suspended in the clouds, purer the further it was from life. But then life vibrated like water hit by a stone: war, division, poverty, spiritual deadlock. People flocked to temples, but if asked where spirituality was in this life, they'd burst into helpless laughter. Perhaps it stood on the sidelines, watching people struggle in the mud without daring to get its hands dirty. This detachment forces us to ask, is spirituality only for display? The harsh truth is, spirituality did enter life, but only in form names, robes, incense. Its spirit, its breath of compassion, its wisdom were buried under the dust of time. If spirituality lives only by its coverings, it will dry up like a piece of wood forgotten in the sun. People still pray, still believe, but deep within there's an inexpressible emptiness. The greatest paradox: whoever wants to save the world must understand the world. To transcend, one must step into it, separate from life to attain spiritual insight. But once attained, one must return to the secular, bringing the light ignited in the darkness. If one only flees, never daring to touch, that spirituality cannot grow beyond anything, like a seed afraid of dirty soil, remaining in hand, it withers instead of growing into a tree. Looking around, we see ancient moss-covered pagodas. Once, they echoed with learning and meditation. Now, many places only host ceremonies, offerings, and organizational tasks. Those in brown robes are busy like spiritual service staff, while the stillness necessary for spiritual attainment dissipates amidst the worldly noise. Spirituality is dragged by life without the strength to lead. Beneath this current, there's another layer of mud. Young intellectuals, artists, professionals. They seek in spirituality a living ideal. They enter, then withdraw, finding no place for themselves. They want to serve with their abilities, but spirituality only expects them to stand by as followers. This conflict leaves them present in body but absent in heart. An entire generation is suspended, believing in spirituality but unable to live by it. That's when we understand that old frameworks are no longer broad enough. The old ways of practice are no longer suitable for the new mindset. If spirituality is to have a future, it must dare to break the mold, to admit that change is painful but healthy, like an old bamboo tree whose trunk needs to crack for new shoots to emerge. But change is not destruction. Those who came before had their reasons, those who come after have their aspirations. This encounter will be full of friction, but if both sides know that each is protecting what they believe, then the point of pain might become the point of birth. From here, we return to a pivotal question. If spirituality is to lead, it needs people who embody it. A deep inner life cannot sprout amidst the chaos of work. It requires havens for spiritual training, places where practitioners truly cut ties with attachments and return to their inner selves. There, they are not concerned with rituals, not burdened by economics, not caught up in external calls. Water must settle to become clear. The mind must be still to perceive deeply. Not everyone embarks on this path. It requires a will like fire, knowledge as a foundation, and endurance to pass through years without the light of glory. Yet, just a few such places are enough to sustain the spiritual current. Just one person who attains spiritual insight can become a wellspring for countless others. Therefore, a true monastery is not a refuge, but a spiritual laboratory where individuals light their own torches and journey forth. Looking back, it's not hard to see spirituality at a crossroads. Either continue to be complacent in rituals or bravely embark on the true work of spiritual nourishment. One path is easy but hollow, the other is arduous but can save oneself and society. And that is where we begin to lay the foundation. We must rebuild environments for genuine practice. We must nurture people who dare to attain spiritual insight rather than mere fame. We must create spaces where intellectuals, young people, and artists find meaning, not where they merely fall in line and obey, but where they co-create, sharing responsibility for this life. In this stream of thought, fragments of reality spread out like a painting being peeled back. Spirituality is not dead, but it is gasping in an old form. For it to live, the doors must open for new winds to enter. But new winds are not meant to deny the roots, but to rekindle the ancient material that lies dormant. For this reason, a true return is not turning away from life, but entering life with a sharpened mind. At that point, transcendence and immanence are no longer in opposition. Spiritual attainment is not found in deep mountains, but precisely where people clash. When reality is seen face to face, every breath is an act of spiritual practice. But to enter life without being swallowed whole, one needs a foundation. Humans cannot draw strength from an empty void. Spiritual nourishment must begin in a conducive environment where the mind settles, where the will is tested. This is not a place for decorative lanterns, but a place for silent, persistent training, like a blacksmith. The steadier the fire, the harder the steel, and spirituality needs such forges. Once, temples were such places. Those within learned to practice, living not to serve external rituals but to look deeply within. But over the years, these spaces transformed. Practitioners were drawn to the social stage, organizing events, serving public religious needs. These needs are not wrong, but when they overshadow the core, spirituality becomes dim, like a lamp choked by smoke. Those in brown robes, once expected to embody spiritual attainment, often now become ritual managers, and people easily confuse chanting a lot, being gentle, or patient with virtue. They think this is practice. But deep spiritual attainment does not lie in these external manifestations. It demands internal breakthrough, not just the surface of reverence or endurance. Therefore, places separate from the hustle and bustle are needed, where practitioners are free to pursue spiritual realization. Such places should not open their doors to become crowded pilgrimage sites. Those who enter must have a sufficiently solid intellectual foundation, just as someone entering a laboratory must have a minimum understanding of science. No one expects someone lacking skills to enter and merely sit idle, jeopardizing the work of others. Those who wish to embark on this path must study, not to show off, but to understand the direction. Knowledge of spirituality cannot be swallowed through blind faith. It must be understood like seeing a river from its source to the sea, understanding why water flows, why it meanders. When one understands the historical nature of doctrine, when one sees the Dharma not as an unchangeable rock, but as a living, constantly renewing current, only then can practitioners break free from rigid molds and have the opportunity to touch the profound original meaning. This is not easy, but if one is content with mere form, one will forever remain at the threshold. To enter deeper, one must dare to shed packaged beliefs and replace them with honest inquiry. Paradoxically, this very inquiry is the most loyal act to spirituality. But even when one has learned enough, living a life of spiritual attainment still requires challenges in that place. A person is observed not by others, but by themselves. They must learn to be silent, to look into the dark regions of the mind without fleeing. They must accept not clinging to praise, not lulling themselves with the feeling that they are good enough. Everything is placed on a rigorous journey where the only reward is transformation. It sounds like a lofty dream, but in reality, it's very close to social life. Everyone feels that life needs a guide, but few see that the guide must undergo humility and self-discipline. Spirituality is the same. To guide life, there must be those who attain spiritual insight. To have such people, there must be places for them to train. Yet, in society, many people expect spirituality to help them without realizing that spirituality also needs to be nurtured. People go to temples hoping for blessings, but few ask where the temple gets its spiritual strength if those within have no time for spiritual attainment. The more ceremonies, the more demands, the less time for inner life. And so, spirituality is weakened by the very hands of those who love it. From this contradiction, another truth emerges. For spirituality to live, its way of life must change. Monasteries must be established as places for spiritual attainment, not as places to serve rituals. Organizations must reevaluate. They cannot drag all practitioners into the whirlwind of external activities. Otherwise, spirituality will only be a machine without a soul. At the same time, spirituality must also open its doors to those who wish to serve with their unique abilities: intellectuals, artists, economists. They can become powerful conduits for spirituality to enter society, but spirituality must make a place for them, a place where they can contribute, not just listen. Otherwise, they will remain outside. And when they remain outside, spirituality loses its creative force, loses its guiding hand. Looking back at history, there have been times when spirituality changed its form to adapt to new lands, but then over the years, that flexibility was replaced by rigidity. Now, we are at a similar crossroads. Those who came before have the strength of tradition, those who come after have the strength of new awareness. To save spirituality, both must make the effort to understand each other. Even if it causes pain to both sides, this dialogue is not about who wins or loses, but about finding where light can penetrate. Like a rice seed knowing it must disintegrate to become a plant, the old must make way for the new to grow. Spirituality has risen from crises many times, and so it is now. The opportunity still exists if we dare to step into pain without shrinking back. Yet, people often forget that every transformation begins from within. People build more temples, erect more pillars, consecrate more bells. But if no one truly attains spiritual insight, those forms are just paint covering a cracked wall. We can deceive the world, but we cannot deceive the weariness of the soul. When someone commits to living fully for spiritual attainment, that person becomes a different kind of being. They don't prove their sacredness with words or robes, but with an indefinable vitality. Meeting them, one's heart settles without needing anyone to teach. It is this very presence that is the true guarantee for spirituality. And therefore, truly spiritual monasteries do not need to be many, only authentic. Because just a few places with people of spiritual attainment are enough to keep the current alive. But for those places to exist, one also needs to look squarely at reality. People often pull practitioners out of their quiet places to serve the organization. The shortage of capable people means all energies are utilized for administrative tasks. And the more administration, the shallower the spirituality, like a stream diverted to water fields until its bed gradually dries up. Therefore, it is necessary to decisively recognize that some people must be reserved for spiritual attainment. not to be pulled out to be managers, not to be measured by immediate results. Because without them, spirituality will lose both its compass and its horizon. These individuals embark on a path that does not guarantee glory, but carries an invisible heavy responsibility to become the source of the source. However, change is not only in monasteries. Spirituality is also lacking something else, a way to integrate into social activities constructively, not just to meet religious needs. For example, in education, spirituality has only touched older generations, while the path to intellectuals and youth is lost. Educators want to serve with their profession, but find no place to do so. They are forced to see spirituality as a visiting place rather than a place to live and build. This situation occurs not only in education, but also in art, economics, and society. A musician wants to revive sacred music, but spirituality lacks training schools, research committees, and a suitable environment. He is forced to stand by and watch sacred music become distorted, knowing that if properly nurtured, it could become the heart of spiritual life. An economist understands that if spirituality wants to help society, it must have a stance on social issues, ownership, and development. But he finds no plan or such thinking anywhere in the organization. The only place where spirituality operates effectively is in charitable activities, but charity alone is not enough to lay the foundation for social change. Compassion is important, but if it stops at mere giving without a transformative mindset, spirituality has not truly manifested in the vital currents forming the nation. These examples are not meant to criticize, but to show a truth. Spirituality needs a rebuilding. In this rebuilding, intellectuals and young people should not stand outside, but must be invited in as builders. Because if spirituality only has the hands of believers, but lacks the wisdom of thinkers, it will be a river without guiding banks. Nevertheless, change requires accepting conflict. The old and the new must collide like shifting tectonic plates. Those who uphold tradition fear losing values. Those who seek reform fear being trapped in old molds. But if both look deeper, they will realize their goal is one, that spirituality lives, not merely exists. In this shift, attitude is crucial. If we consider doctrine or institutional rules immutable, we have imposed death upon spirituality, because everything established was only suitable for a specific period. To view them as eternal molds is to betray the very spirit they sought to preserve. Spirituality lives by a spirit of non-attachment. When we cling, we are the ones who snatch away its breath. Therefore, when re-examining the path of spiritual monasteries, one understands that they cannot be closed-off places, nor can they be turned into mere sites of ceremonies. They must be centers for nurturing genuine practice. But this practice cannot remain confined to the mountains. It must flow back into life, like water from a source must return to the river. Otherwise, spiritual attainment becomes an empty, self-satisfied, useless vessel. From this, what becomes clearest is that spirituality must learn to reorganize itself, but with a spirit of freedom. Not freedom of abandon, but freedom to create. Well-organized, yet not bound by organization. Architecturally solid, yet remembering that the wind must blow through. This is a sharp balance, like walking on a tightrope. These lessons are not for strangers, but for those living with spirituality in a time of crisis. The question is no longer whether to change, but how to change while preserving the essence and germinating the future. This is difficult but unavoidable, because the path ahead is not measured by new bricks, but by spirituality rediscovering its breath precisely in its encounter with reality. At that point, spirituality no longer stands in an ivory tower, but walks in the world with a firm mind, an open intellect, a bright heart. And perhaps that is the image spirituality originally wanted to embody. Every effort to bring spirituality into life must return to a simple starting point. The vision must be correct for the steps not to stray. To change how we live, we must first change how we see. For too long, people have spoken of spirituality as something that only requires belief. But faith without wisdom easily turns into unconscious habit. Therefore, the path opened in this section begins with awareness, not with idle debate. In this view, doctrine is no longer a dense, immutable block, but two parallel currents. One delves deep into inner spiritual attainment, where each person finds radical transformation. The other flows into social life, where spirituality does not stand idly by but speaks out, shapes, and guides. These two currents are not separate, they lean on each other. If the inside is not firm, the outside cannot be firm, but if the inside does not flow out, it will die like stagnant water. For this vision to take shape, it needs principles like hinges opening a door. The first principle is breaking attachment, meaning not letting the mind be closed off in any form, even the form of spirituality itself. Breaking attachment is not denial, but liberation from clinging. The second principle is experiential practice, meaning not believing in what has not been lived through. Spirituality only has value when it becomes experience, not a slogan. The third principle is adaptability to circumstances. Kiko, which is knowing what is suitable for the capacity and context. What is right in one place may not be right in another. And finally, skillful means, which is knowing how to choose the appropriate approach so that the spiritual essence has a foothold in reality. These four principles are not meant to create a new philosophy, but to detoxify the application of doctrine. Through them, people avoid the risk of burying themselves in academia and forgetting life, or plunging into activity and forgetting their spiritual foundation. Only when these four principles live in the practitioner can spirituality be soft enough to navigate changing circumstances. From that foundation, the view of suffering also changes. Suffering is not something to be avoided, but the root from which compassion arises. If suffering is seen as damage to be discarded, we also discard the door to entering people's hearts. But if suffering is seen as a call, we realize that love and compassion are not mere moral decorations, but essential ingredients for entering life. Thus, each suffering is not just a reality to be transformed, but also living proof of the ideal of service. At that very moment, doctrine no longer remains on paper but becomes an active philosophy. Spirituality does not stop at contemplation but must step out to solve life's problems. But it steps out not with blind enthusiasm, but with a refined foundation of understanding. The practitioner, thanks to this, does not get lost amidst countless activities. They know what they are doing, why they are doing it, and where the boundary lies between action and ego. This seems obvious, but reality has proven otherwise. Many people engage in spiritual work but lack inner roots, so they are easily drawn into superficial activities, only to become the most exhausted. Meanwhile, those with knowledge and passion stand outside because they do not find a structure solid enough for them to integrate. An active philosophy becomes a bridge between two sides, the meditator and the activist, the intuitive and the analytical. Looking deeper, we see that an active philosophy is not just a tool for living, but also a test of whether spirituality still has the power to become a cultural force. If spirituality only knows how to stay within temple gates, it will fall into a state of existing without living. But if spirituality steps out without a foundation of understanding, it will be swept away by life. Only when the two sides meet can spirituality preserve its soul without fear of dissolution. And so, from that foundation of awareness, big questions emerge. How to correctly integrate spirituality into religious practice, how to prevent rituals from obscuring spiritual transformation, how can art, education, and economics not just wear the cloak of spirituality, but truly permeate it. These questions are not meant to be answered immediately, but to open up subsequent journeys. One thing clearly emerges like a streak of light. Spirituality must enter life but must not lose itself. There are fields that seem close to spirituality but are actually far astray, like religious practice becoming pure ritual. Conversely, there are fields that seem far from spirituality, like education, art, and economics, but are fertile ground if the right seeds are sown. The meeting point between these two lines is awareness. With the right view, any place can become spiritual. With the wrong view, any place can become delusion. Spirituality does not need many slogans. Spirituality needs a deep insight capable of transformation. Once seen, action will come naturally, like a tree knowing to turn itself towards the light without anyone teaching it. And that is the starting point for spirituality to enter life while maintaining its own breath. When the foundation of awareness has been lit like a lamp, the question naturally arises, where does that light go? Which areas of life does it illuminate for spirituality to truly be present? From here, we step into specific domains that spirituality must touch if it wants to live as a vital force, not just a symbol. The first domain is religious life. It seems this area is closest to spirituality, but in reality, it is where spirituality is most misunderstood. People go to temples out of habit, for comfort, for blessings. But few realize that true religious practice must nourish compassion, break attachments, and foster a will to serve. A place of worship is not a transactional station for requests, but a crucible for the mind. Therefore, spirituality needs a religious way of life that ensures each person who goes to a temple not only prays but is also educated, not only asks but also learns to give. To achieve this, 3 pillars are needed. The first is the temple, not as a physical structure, but as a spiritual homeland. It must appear in people's hearts as a warm place to return to, not as a venue for organizing rituals. The second pillar is the guide, who must not just be someone who chants scriptures or organizes, but someone with spiritual attainment, capable of opening the minds of others. Otherwise, the guide will only lead into a labyrinth. The final pillar is a study program that is deep and practical enough to nurture awareness and behavior, not stopping at a few rituals without transformation. When these 3 elements converge, religious practice is no longer just blind faith, but becomes a way of life that helps people's lives become softer, deeper, and brighter. But if one of the 3 is missing, religious practice easily turns into a display of ceremonies, where spirituality is consumed like a spiritual product serving immediate comfort needs. Leaving the domain of religious practice, we come to the second domain, literature and art. If spirituality is the source, art is the stream. But this stream has dried up in many places due to a lack of nurturing environments. Sacred music, once the heart of spiritual life, often now is just a perfunctory accompaniment to rituals. Lacking hands that understand spirituality while also understanding music and literature, these forms become empty shells. There must be places to foster creativity, environments where artists can live, learn, and serve. Otherwise, spirituality will only preserve old forms without being able to recreate itself. And if forms do not change, spirituality will suffocate because it cannot find a way to speak to people today. Next, the third domain is education. People tend to think spirituality is only for adults. But if society is to change, spirituality must be present in the fundamental upbringing of individuals. Education is not just about transmitting knowledge. It is about creating people with wisdom that breaks attachments, with compassion, and who know how to serve. If spirituality neglects this field, it will only reach those who are weary, but fail to create a generation that lives by its aspirations. Going further, the fourth domain is economics and society. This may seem unfamiliar, but if spirituality wants to transform human life, it cannot stand outside these vital currents. The work of helping the world cannot rely solely on charity. For charity, though necessary, does not address the structure of suffering. Spirituality must have a stance, a mindset, and methods regarding society. It must raise questions about how to organize people, how to develop the economy so as not to destroy spiritual life, how to help communities stand on their own feet rather than just receive aid. These areas all offer fertile ground for spirituality, but to enter them, spirituality must have enough wisdom and courage. Because when spirituality enters these areas, it will be tested by reality, by power struggles, by conflicts of interest. Without an active philosophy as its backbone, practitioners can easily be swept away, losing both themselves and the ideals of spirituality. This is not a path for a single class of people. It requires the participation of intellectuals, artists, educators, and economists. They do not stand outside spirituality as spectators, but as functional contributors. If spirituality wants to breathe, it must borrow their lungs. If it wants to walk, it must borrow their feet. The expansion into these domains reveals a paradox. The things thought to be most sacred, like rituals, risk suffocating spirituality if they lack genuine practice, while the most mundane fields like education, art, and economics have the potential to circulate spirituality's spirit if guided correctly. This creates an unavoidable demand. Spirituality must know what is the root and what is the shadow, what is form and what is the vital current. And from that, a silent truth forms. Spirituality is not separate from life. It is only separate when we place it in an ivory tower. If it knows how to enter each field with the right view, spirituality does not need to demand people believe in it. They will feel it. But even if light has found its way into every field, there is still something precarious. This path is not smooth. Wherever there is innovation, there is conflict. Not everyone wants to leave their comfort zone. Those who uphold tradition worry that opening the door will dilute the values they cherish. Those who want to innovate fear that if things remain the same, spirituality will become so old that it cannot live. In reality, the two sides are not as far apart as they think. Both are protecting spirituality, differing only in their methods. The conservatives fear losing the form, the innovators fear losing the soul. If both meet at a deeper perspective, they will realize that spirituality does not lie in form or dogma, but in its capacity to live, its capacity to transform. Protecting spirituality means keeping it alive, not keeping it still. Looking at reality, even those labeled conservative must confront social truths. If they are willing to examine the contemporary psychological and social situation, they will see that people today no longer have the patience for forms without content. Spirituality cannot hope for people's respect merely for its form. People need spiritual support, but they also need reason to believe that spirituality understands them and responds to them. Similarly, those who seek innovation cannot deny traditional values, because tradition, when viewed correctly, is the very soil for sowing new seeds. Whoever discards the soil, the plant will lack a foundation. Innovation without understanding tradition is blind innovation, prone to extremism, shattering the delicate bonds that nourish spirituality from within. Fortunately, there is still common ground between the two sides, the spirit of freedom that spirituality inherently carries. This has been mentioned in statutes that each traditional nuance has the right to be maintained and developed. This spirit allows multiple forms of spiritual practice to coexist, like a garden with many flowers. Difference is not a threat but the material for integration. This spirit opens a new direction. Modernization is not about imposing a new model on everyone, but allowing existing forms to blossom in ways most suitable to their inherent capacity and reality. Perhaps from the existing activities within the spiritual community, sprouts of innovation will emerge. If these young sprouts live in accordance with the spirit of spirituality, they will become the vital force guiding the entire garden. If they chase after the secular, forgetting their roots, they will wither. No one will need to cut them down. In the same vein, another paradox emerges. Many people try to change spirituality through theory, but forget that spirituality changes itself through its living vitality. People can write many projects, many philosophies, but if there are no practitioners who attain spiritual insight and actively engage in life, those theories will remain on paper. Change is not about writing differently, but about living differently. This brings us back to a simple yet painful reality. Whether spirituality lives or dies does not lie in rituals, slogans, or organizations, but in individuals with true spiritual attainment. If such people exist, spirituality will grow organically. If not, no matter how many times the methods are changed, spirituality will remain but a shadow. But recognizing this is not to be pessimistic, but to know where to place the emphasis. Change does not begin with debate, but with an inner transformation of those who enter spirituality. From there, activities, education, art, and economics will have their own ways of transformation. Looking at the whole picture, this section is like a spiral, starting from awareness, flowing into action, penetrating every area of life, then returning to the inner dialogue of spirituality with itself. It doesn't end with a declaration, but with an open door. If spirituality walks in its true spirit, even in a storm, it will live. But if spirituality clings to the shell and loses its soul, even if no one opposes it, it will fade away on its own. The bright spot is here. Spirituality does not need to fight anything to exist. It only needs to live true to its nature. And that nature lies in transformation, in freedom, in compassion, in wisdom that breaks attachments. When these qualities enter religious life, into art, into education, into society, spirituality will be present as a silent but persistent current. But when they are absent, all religious forms are just empty shells. Do not try to save spirituality by adding more external shells. Save spirituality by reviving the inner current. If this can be done, the conflicts between old and new will no longer be battlefronts but driving forces, like two currents of water clashing to create waves. What has been illuminated before is like building a foundation. But a foundation is only meaningful when there is an exit built upon it. Enough has been said about monasteries, about an active philosophy, about spirituality needing to enter life. Now, the question is no longer why, but how. It is at this moment that a new path emerges, not through theory, but through a concrete form of life. For a long time, everyone has seen a paradox. There are countless young people, intellectuals, artist souls seeking a deeper meaning in life, but they cannot enter closed monasteries. Monastic life demands that they leave their professions, accept a way of life that doesn't suit their temperament and abilities. They stand between two shores, wanting to serve but finding no door. If spirituality doesn't create a way for them, they will retreat. And when they retreat, spirituality loses the force that could create a new identity. And so, another idea appeared, simple like a sprout but with a life force strong enough to push through the thick layer of earth above. Engaged monastic orders emerge, groups of people who live in the world while practicing, not separating from society but also not dissolving into it. These people are not half monk, half layperson, in the sense of lacking commitment, but rather individuals who bring the spirit of spiritual attainment into every sector of society. Thus, instead of demanding that everyone abandon their professions, spirituality invites them to bring their professions into service. An educator becomes a teaching monk nun. A social activist becomes a community service monk nun. Someone skilled in sacred music becomes a monk nun who preserves and creates spiritual culture. Each profession becomes a specialized stream. But for this idea not to sink into mere dreaming, a new ecclesiastical structure is needed. This structure must have two arms, one arm protecting the transcendent community, ensuring that those who attain spiritual insight have the conditions to live and become a source. The other arm opens the way for those who want to serve without living a secluded monastic life. Instead of considering practitioners to belong to only one form, the ecclesiastical structure must acknowledge many different lifestyles, all aiming for the same ideal. This is not to replace monasteries, but to create a second tier of spiritual life. The core monastic stream, the NHAP, remains central, holding the role of the revered center, the wellspring of spiritual attainment. But around this core, there need to be streams of people living in the world like long-spreading roots, drawing nourishment from the earth and feeding the main tree. When visualized more clearly, the picture becomes concrete. These engaged monastic orders are like the specialized departments of the spiritual community. Some choose to serve in education, becoming those who bring spirituality into classrooms, training intellects and minds. Some choose healthcare, becoming caretakers of physical and mental suffering. Some choose art and ritual, restoring sacred music, creating symbolic languages that nourish the spirit. And some choose finance, playing the role of sustaining all activities, ensuring spirituality is not stifled by lack of basic necessities. They are both practitioners and specialized staff of the spiritual institution. But unlike secular civil servants, they are not driven by personal gain, but by ideals and responsibility. Their lives are secured so they can wholeheartedly dedicate themselves to service, without the burden of earning a livelihood bending their will. This is a small but important detail. For if spirituality wants talented people to commit, it must have a method to sustain them, not just let them live on vague self-sacrifice. However, to join these streams requires more than just enthusiasm. Those who serve must have a foundation. They need to study, to train. At minimum, they must complete high school and then undergo several years of college-level Buddhist studies. This phase is a process of refinement, where young people are tested to see if they have enough will, enough understanding, enough patience to embark on a long path. These years of study are not just about learning texts, but about living in a spiritual learning environment, practicing work, practicing service. As a result, graduates not only have knowledge but also experience living spirituality. They know how to stand before others as maturing guides, not as rote learners of scriptures. When they are ready, each person is invited to choose their own path. If their heart is directed towards spiritual attainment and they wish to live a deep inner life, they enter the core monastic stream. If their heart desires service and to live in the world, they join an engaged monastic order, becoming the arms of spirituality in society. Both paths are respected, because a person's value lies not in their form of life, but in their direction and the realization of their ideals. This requires a sufficiently robust training institution. Therefore, the image of a social service youth school emerges as an essential living seedbed, an environment where seeds are nurtured, where young people live in the discipline of spirituality, learn Buddhism, practice, and gain practical experience in service professions. From there, the new generation of spirituality is not found among those who voluntarily leave the world, but is programmed from the outset as seeds that clearly know their path. The emergence of this model is not an embellishment, but a way out of a long-standing deadlock. If monasteries are solely concerned with the source of spiritual attainment, but lack hands and feet to enter society, spirituality will be thin like a skeleton without flesh. And if those capable of serving society are not invited, spirituality will become impoverished, living only on gentleness but lacking organizational strength. Seen this way, this new model is like connecting two separated halves: spiritual attainment and action, ideal and reality, inner self and society. It is a bridge so that practitioners do not stand outside life, and so that people in life do not stand outside spirituality. And when the new model has taken shape, the story moves to the operational level. For an idea alone does not make a life. A structure needs people, roles, division of labor, and training. And this is where spirituality becomes most concrete. It reorganizes itself like a living organism, where each part is correctly placed to nourish the whole. In this picture, the engaged monastic orders are not a chaotic, haphazard group. They are formed as distinct specialized streams. Some choose to teach. They become those who bring spirituality into the classroom, educating intellects and minds. Some choose healthcare. They become those who care for the suffering of body and mind. Some choose art and ritual. They restore sacred music, creating symbolic language that nourishes the spirit. And some choose finance. They play the role of sustaining activities, ensuring spirituality is not choked by lack of sustenance. They are both practitioners and functional staff of the spiritual community. But unlike secular civil servants, they are not driven by self-interest, but by ideals and responsibility. Their lives are secured so they can wholeheartedly dedicate themselves to service, without the burden of earning a living bending their will. This is a small but important detail, because if spirituality wants skilled people to commit, it must have a method to sustain them, not just expect them to live on vague sacrifice. However, joining these streams requires more than just enthusiasm. Those who serve must have a foundation. They need to study, to train. At minimum, they must complete high school, then undergo several years of college-level Buddhist studies. This phase is a process of refinement, where young people are tested to see if they have enough will, enough understanding, enough patience to embark on the long path. These years of study are not just about learning texts, but about living in a spiritual learning environment, practicing work, practicing service. As a result, graduates not only have knowledge but also experience living spirituality. They know how to stand before others as maturing guides, not as rote learners of doctrine. When they are ready, each person is invited to choose their own path. If their heart is directed towards spiritual attainment and they wish to live a deep inner life, they enter the core monastic stream. If their heart wants to serve and live in the world, they join an engaged monastic order, becoming the arms of spirituality in society. Both paths are respected because a person's value lies not in their form of life, but in their direction and the realization of their ideals. This requires a strong enough training institution. Therefore, the image of a social service youth school emerges as a necessary living seedbed, where seeds are cultivated, where young people live within the discipline of spirituality, learn Buddhism, and train in a profession to later enter life as a specialized monastic. Not everyone will become a master of spiritual attainment, but everyone can become a servant. It is here that spirituality can tell society that it is not just a place for spiritual reassurance. It has the capacity to train spiritual leaders, educators, and social servants. That is the transformation from a belief into an organized force. This also clarifies a previously vague division of labor, the transcendent path and the immanent path. The transcendent path, the core monastic stream, maintains a profound role, like wells dug deep into the earth to preserve the source of spiritual water. The imminent path, the engaged monastic orders, are like canals, bringing that water to fields, to thirsty places. These two paths complement each other. If there is only the transcendent path, spirituality will dry up in the monastery. If there is only the imminent path, spirituality will be loose, lacking foundation. One is the source, the other is the flow. Together they form a river. But this much is not enough for this structure to stand firm. Spirituality also needs to announce itself to the world, to let society know that a modernization project is being built, not for boasting, but to call out to kindred spirits. The world needs to know that spirituality is seeking a new path, and the nation needs to know that spirituality is not only concerned with itself, but also has the will to contribute to the enlightenment of the people. Looking broader, this model is not just for young people seeking meaning. It is an invitation from spirituality to intellectuals, artists, those who once stood outside feeling that spirituality was too far from life. If spirituality opens its doors and grants responsibility, they will step in. If spirituality only expects those willing to be confined to old molds, it will forever lack the hands and minds that can rebuild its destiny. Spirituality does not want to exist through nostalgia. It wants to live through the present, through people, through organization, through service. And this model is proof of a profound will. If it sees the right path, spirituality can be reborn from an old tree into a forest. When the structure is built, when the path is opened, there is still one final piece of the journey. A frank, somewhat solitary statement that needs to be uttered. Because building a new model is not just a theoretical matter, but facing the reality of psychology, culture, and even the silent resistance within those in spirituality itself. Here, the first thing recognized is that speaking these words is an act of commitment. It may make many uncomfortable. It may be seen as breaking tradition, but that does not diminish its necessity. Because this voice does not come from argumentation, but from experience, from collisions with the real suffering of both spirituality and life. Therefore, it does not need anyone's applause. It is simply a word that must be spoken to avoid being stifled. Then comes the call. A call not for anyone in particular, but directed at those who can truly change the destiny of spirituality. Intellectuals, young people, cultural workers, those who are restless with the meaning of life. If they stand outside, spirituality will only be left with rituals and organizers. But if they step in, spirituality will have a thinking hand, a creative heart, eyes that see through society. This also contains a painful but true fact. Spirituality has enormous potential to build people, to free the nation from the stagnation and unhealthiness that is eroding society. But that potential is being neglected. It sleeps in scriptures, sleeps in monasteries, sleeps in ceremonies. If only it can be awakened, spirituality can become a civilizing force, not just a place for spiritual reassurance. However, awakening that potential does not come from waiting for miracles. It comes from action, from changing ecclesiastical structures, from not viewing spirituality as a place that only receives those seeking salvation, but as a place that organizes and trains capable people to serve. If intellectuals, youth, and artists are not invited to actively join the ranks, spirituality will continue its weary cycle, waiting for people to come for comfort, then quietly watching society follow its own trajectory. At this point, a paradox unfolds like a challenge. Many things spoken here have been considered utopian, but the greatest paradox is that these utopian ideas can become reality. Because spirituality does not lack vitality, it only lacks people to ignite that vitality. People often think the greatest threat to spirituality comes from external opposition, but in fact, the greatest threat is internal inertia. Therefore, this final section is like handing over a flame. It doesn't just conclude a series of analyses, but opens up responsibility. If someone feels a calling within them, they cannot stand still. If someone feels that spirituality can live differently, they cannot merely hope. If someone finds that model reasonable, they must become the one who makes it a reality. These words are not spoken in a shouting tone, but in the subdued timbre of someone who has seen enough ups and downs to understand that change is painful, but not changing is even more painful. And the final question echoes unspoken. Who will take the first step? Perhaps the only comfort is faith. Faith not as something vague, but as a conclusion drawn from carefully observing reality. Spirituality has been revived many times from what seemed like the brink of demise. This time, too. If we dare to act, if we dare to invite, if we dare to train and entrust responsibility, then what is now on these pages can become life. New people will emerge, new spiritual orders will take shape. And spirituality will no longer be an old man remembering the past, but will become the cultural life force of a nation seeking its path. In that view, this section does not close but opens. It does not give us tranquility, but offers a seed for the listener to ask themselves where they will plant it. Because if it remains only in memory, everything just said will be as light as smoke. But if it falls into the right hands, it can become a great tree, standing majestically in life, offering both shade and fruit. Spirituality does not need many miracles, it needs people. And if those people exist, what is today an idea will become life. As history has silently witnessed countless times, some traditions remain only as hard, dry shells, quietly existing like relics amidst a bustling society. Other traditions, despite enduring myriad challenges, constantly transform and rejuvenate themselves, integrating into every movement of life. It is this ability to shed its skin that truly demonstrates intrinsic vitality, not just for one doctrine, but for any value that wishes to endure. Rereading the journey of modernization, one realizes that preserving essence is not forbidding innovation, but daring to re-examine oneself in the endless flow of change. The paradox is that if one fears change, identity will wither in its own stubborn pride. But if one changes arbitrarily, the soul will be swept away, dissolving into countless fragments, with nothing left to recognize. True life always finds a way between these two extremes, like a red thread running through every transformation. The lesson here is not merely moral reminders, nor a success formula for renewing tradition. It is a warning. There is no ready-made template for long-term existence. Each historical period, each generation that passes, must confront the pain of change, the doubt about what it is preserving, in order to grow. Tradition must learn to befriend crisis, turning adversity into nourishment, transforming all opposition into a driving force for creation. The greatest courage, it turns out, lies not in defending the old or breaking all limits, but in the ability to constantly question, what is truly the essence, and what is merely the dust of time? And in that journey, everyone must learn to accept the loneliness of the pioneer, bravely standing at the intersection of light and shadow, of safety and uncertainty. And then the question for each person is not what have we done to preserve, but how vividly and creatively have we dared to live so that the very tradition we uphold must also awaken, full of vitality as in its beginning. Today's generation needs not only a legacy to lean on, but also a space to experiment, create, and set new boundaries. Will you choose to stand by and watch tradition wither, or will you plunge into the current of innovation, ready to face imperfection, with setbacks, so that you yourself become a part of that metamorphosis? Perhaps this society doesn't need more perfectly preserved traditionalists, and certainly not aimless rebels. What is needed are people who love their roots, appreciate the past, but are also strong enough to throw open new doors for the future, where old and new values interact, debate, and finally create a fresh, vibrant current. What do you think about the boundary between preservation and change? Can a tradition, a value, a belief truly be vibrant if it only revolves around itself? If you have the opportunity to contribute a voice, will you choose to be a protector or a creator? Or will you try to become that very adventurous intersection? If these reflections resonate with you, do not remain silent. Leave a comment, share your views, experiences, or concerns about renewing tradition. It's not just a matter of religion, but an issue for every community, every individual living in society today.